Sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting dappled patterns across the old prop trunk. The air carried the scent of wood and aging pine, a smell I had known for most of my life. I knelt on the living room floor, carefully unlatching the worn leather case, my fingers gliding over its scratched surface. Each prop inside was a trace of my 30 years in the theater, a relic of dreams chased, battles fought, and lonely nights endured. I lifted a tattered feathered hat, its once proud plumes now drooping and faded. It was the very first piece I hand-stitched when I built my first stage set for a tiny theater in San Francisco. That winter had been bitterly cold. I remember working under a dim bulb, breath misting in the frigid air, my fingers stiff from the cold, but refusing to stop, sewing each feather with stubborn, trembling hands. Caleb had been just 5 years old then, curled up on a threadbare little sofa beside me, wrapped snugly in a patchwork quilt I'd stitched together from old clothes. I set the hat down gently and picked up a battered prop clock, its face missing 2 or 3 numbers, looking oddly endearing. That clock had been part of a play about time travel. I still remember the night it broke just before a show. Caleb and I crouched in the alley behind the theater, fixing it by flashlight. He sat close by, munching on a peanut butter sandwich I had packed for him, wide-eyed as he watched me work with pliers and glue, carefully patching the cracked clock face. In the cold night air, his tiny voice piped up, "Mommy, when I grow up, I'll buy you a new clock." I had laughed, ruffling his messy hair. "Then I'll be waiting for one that's big and shiny." That memory unwound in my mind like an old film reel, soft and grainy. I had been so young then, broke, exhausted but full of hope, carrying the heavy weight of life on my back. I still fought to build a small, wobbly, but warm little world for Caleb and me. Next, I pulled out a navy blue wool cloak, embroidered with tiny hand-stitched stars. I had made it for a winter fairy tale production back when Caleb was in elementary school. He used to love it. Would drape it around his shoulders at home, pretending to be a wizard, brandishing a broomstick and shouting spells, his laughter filling every inch of our cramped apartment. I felt a smile tug at the corner of my mouth, but it faded just as quickly. Time had pushed us both forward. It pushed Caleb toward growing up, building his own world, and it nudged me, little by little, out of the center of his life. I knew this was natural. Children are supposed to grow up, to have their own lives, their own families. But what I hadn't expected was how silently that tide of distance would rise, seeping into my life, soaking me in a quiet, aching loneliness I hadn't even realized was there. I folded the cloak carefully and placed it into a fresh storage bin. As I packed, a quiet question gnawed at me. For all these years, I had given everything to this family, never complaining, never regretting. But now, sitting alone in this hollow living room, surrounded by boxes of fading dreams, I couldn't help but wonder, was there still a place for me in their world, or had I already been quietly, gently, pushed out? I lifted my head and looked out the window. The sky was tinged with the warm gold of sunset, streaked with the first hints of twilight. Somewhere down the street, children's laughter echoed, distant and bright, like a memory from another lifetime. I drew in a slow, deep breath and leaned back against the couch, closing my eyes. Maybe I was just being silly. Maybe this was just the way getting older felt, this creeping, uncertain ache. But right then, I couldn't shake the fear taking root inside me. In the new life Caleb was building, was there still a place left for me? That evening, the sea breeze carried a faint saltiness as it brushed against the car windows. I drove my old SUV, nearly a decade old now, along the long coastal highway toward Caleb's new house. The radio played soft jazz, but my palms were slightly damp against the steering wheel. It was my first proper visit. They had moved into the new place months ago. According to Caleb, they'd been too busy settling in to invite me sooner, and I hadn't wanted to impose. All I knew about the house was what Caleb had briefly mentioned over the phone. It's not big, but it's close to Lola's school. The neighborhood's decent, too. He hadn't said a word about whose down payment had made that possible, or who was still quietly sending monthly checks to ease the burden of their mortgage. Of course, I hadn't planned on bringing it up either. Still, I couldn't explain why I felt so much like a guest tonight, nervous, cautious, even though it was my money that had helped build this home. By the time I pulled up to the curb, twilight had already deepened. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting a soft glow over the neatly trimmed lawn and a little wooden sign that read "Home Sweet Home." I reached over to the passenger seat, picking up the box of homemade cookies I had brought along, just as a familiar voice called out from the porch. "Mom, perfect timingiaria lifesaver." Caleb hurried out, a warm smile on his face, but I caught the flicker of urgency in his eyes. I smiled back, walking up to hand him the cookie box. Then I lifted my gaze and, for the first time, truly took in the sight of their new home. Beige siding, crisp clean lines, a freshly painted front door with a small wind chime tinkling softly in the breeze. Everything looked new, polished, and distant. Taylor soon appeared behind him. She wore a pale cashmere cardigan, her makeup perfectly done. She smiled when she saw me, polite and gracious. "Wow, these look amazing. Thank you, Judy." She took the cookie box and briskly carried it toward the kitchen, her movements efficient, almost perfunctory. I shrugged off my coat and gently hung it on the entryway hook. My eyes wandered around the living room. Neatly arranged gray sofas, matching throw pillows, a diffuser in the corner releasing thin tendrils of lemongrass scent. Every inch was tasteful, coordinated, and none of it had anything to do with me. Caleb led me into the dining room, where the table was already set. Lola was sprawled over one of the chairs, drawing intently. When she spotted me, her whole face lit up. "Grandma." My heart softened. I smiled and knelt beside her, brushing a hand over her soft, honey-brown curls. "You're doing such a beautiful job, sweetheart." Lola giggled, her big eyes sparkling. "Mom, here, sit." Caleb pulled out a chair between him and Lola, motioning for me to take it. I eased into the seat, careful not to disturb the careful order of the room. Dinner, on the surface, went smoothly enough. Taylor chatted about a new project at her boutique brand store, her tone crisp, goal-driven. Caleb chimed in here and there, adding the occasional light-hearted comment. I listened quietly, looking for moments to join the conversation, but every time I opened my mouth, the flow slipped away from me like water through fingers. "We're thinking about paying down part of the mortgage early," Taylor said casually as she speared a forkful of salad. I glanced at Caleb. He hesitated, then forced a small smile. "Yeah, Mom, the mortgage is still a big strain. If we could knock some of it out early, it'd make life a lot easier." The message couldn't have been clearer. They were hoping I would step in again. I set my fork down, my fingers unconsciously tracing patterns into the tablecloth. A knot tightened in my stomach. When I first agreed to help with the down payment, I told myself it was an investment in their future, a way to lighten Caleb's load, to build his happiness. But now, looking at their facetio kind, so distant, I found myself wondering, had I become nothing more than a resource, someone to be tapped when needed, and forgotten when not? After dinner, I offered to play with Lola for a while. "That's fine, but she needs to finish today's workbook first," Taylor said with a gentle but unmistakable firmness. "And Judy, during meals we try to keep things quiet. Focus is important for her." I blinked, a little thrown, but nodded obediently as Lola, clutching her workbook, skipped upstairs. The living room settled into a silence, broken only by the soft hum of the diffuser and the distant rhythm of the ocean. Caleb, sensing the awkwardness, walked over and patted my shoulder. "Mom, once we get through paying down the loan, life will be less stressful. We'll have more time to spend with you." His voice was gentle, reassuring the same way he used to talk when he was a little boy trying to make me smile. But something was missing. The bond we once had, the feeling of being his entire world, was no longer there. I lifted my face into a soft smile and said nothing. Instead, I looked down at my hands resting in my lap, slowly rubbing my fingertips along the seam of my jeans. In that quiet moment, I finally understood, no matter how much I had given, no matter how many foundations I had laid for this family, in their new world, I was no longer the main character. In Caleb's new living room, the diffuser was still humming softly, filling the air with the scent of lemongrass and a hint of vetiver. Outside, the night draped itself like a slow-falling curtain, stretching the streetlight shadows into long, lonely ribbons. I sat on the couch with a cup of mint tea that had long gone cold resting by my side. The television was on, its volume turned way down, playing some popular reality show. Across from me, Taylor sat in a single armchair, a laptop balanced on her knees, her fingers tapping lightly at the keyboard now and then. From the kitchen came the clatter of dishes, Caleb tidying up after dinner, moving with a casual ease. No one spoke. Only the faint laughter from the TV and the gentle clink of ceramic filled the room. I cleared my throat and ventured, "How's Lola doing at school these days?" Taylor glanced up at me, her smile polished and professional. "She's doing well. Her teacher says she has a lot of potential, but we're focusing more on time management and discipline now, so we've cut down on her playtime." With that, she dropped her gaze back to the screen, fingers moving briskly again. Her tone was cool, almost automated, like reading a scripted response. I nodded, awkwardly rubbing my thumb along the edge of my teacup. I had wanted to ask what Lola had been drawing lately, what books she loved. But after that chilly exchange, the words dried up in my throat. A strange feeling of dislocation gripped me. I was the one who had raised Caleb, who had carried him through those hard, lonely years. Yet now, here in the very home I helped them buy, I felt like an outsider, politely included, but expected to stay at the edges, careful not to disrupt the rhythm of their lives. Upstairs, a door clicked shut. The silence deepened. Then Caleb appeared, carrying 3 mugs of coffee, his easy smile breaking the heavy air. "Mom, here, added a little cinnamon, just the way you like it." He handed me a mug, his voice warm and familiar. I took it, my fingers brushing against the faint heat of the ceramic, and a small flicker of warmth stirred in my chest. But almost immediately, it was replaced by a dull, aching sadness. They weren't unkind to Mennett at all, but their kindness had taken on a formal, distant quality, more like the courteous care shown to an aging relative than the effortless intimacy we once shared. I smiled my thanks and took a small sip of the coffee, the slight bitterness pooling on my tongue. The next day, I returned to my quiet little apartment. As soon as I closed the door, the only sounds were the hum of the heater and the gentle creaking of the old wooden floors. I sat down at the small kitchen table and sorted through the stack of mail. Among them was a notification from the bank. "A payment of $1,500 has been successfully debited from your account for Caleb Bank's automatic mortgage payment plan now active." I stared at those cold, sterile numbers for a long moment. Once upon a time, expenses like these had filled me with Pridean investment in Caleb's future, a way to give him a better start. But now, as the money left my account each month, even a simple thank you seemed like a luxury I no longer deserved. I sighed and placed the envelope back on the table. That evening, as usual, I went for a walk through the small park behind my building. The trail, carpeted with pine needles, smelled faintly of salt from the ocean breeze. At the bend, I spotted Martha, me longtime neighbor and friend, sitting on a bench, wearing a soft blue-gray wool hat and reading a thick novel, soaking up the last glow of sunset. "Martha," I called out, smiling as I approached. She waved and patted the empty space beside her. "Come sit a while. You don't look so good. Who's been getting under your skin this time?" I laughed softly and sat down, gazing across the gently sloping lawn. "No one, really," I said in a low voice. "I just feel like I don't fit anymore." She closed her book and turned to me, her sharp, no-nonsense gaze cutting straight through. "Judy, are you spinning your life around other people again?" she asked, without a trace of doubt. "You raised your son. You held up your whole family. That's enough. You don't owe them anything more." I gave a weak smile, unable to argue. Martha reached over and patted my hand, her voice steady and firm. "Stop tying your worth to everyone else. They have their own lives to live. You should be living yours, too." She paused, then added, "Retirement isn't the end, Judy, it's the beginning of real freedom. Look at me. I've never been freer." I looked at her strong, determined profile, and somewhere deep inside me, something gave a quiet, trembling knock. That night, back home, I tossed and turned in bed. Memories rushed over me like a rising tide, Caleb's small hands clutching mine, the hectic, joyful chaos backstage at the theater, the endless sacrifices I had made without a second thought. All my life, I had believed a mother's value was measured by how much she gave, how completely she surrendered. But now, after all those silent offerings, all that unseen devotion, the wall between us had only grown thicker. Maybe it really was time to stop. Maybe it was time to finally ask myself, besides them, was there still a life waiting for me? On Sunday evening, I went to Caleb's house again. He had sounded so casual over the phone. Mom, we're planning a simple dinner at home this weekend, figured we could talk a little about Lola's school plans. Hearing that, a small, tentative warmth bloomed in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, I could still find a way to weave myself back into the rhythm of their lives. Dinner was quiet, proper, and polite. Afterward, I volunteered to help clear the table and wash the dishes. It was then, completely by accident, that I overheard a conversation I was never meant to hear. The kitchen smelled faintly bitter, the rich scent of freshly ground coffee beans hanging in the air. I stood at the sink, rinsing the plates under warm water, my thoughts drifting far from the task at hand. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Caleb and Taylor slip into the small study just off the kitchen. The door didn't click shut, it only swung close enough to leave a narrow, silent crack. I hadn't meant to listen, but that half-open door, it pulled at me, like a quiet magnetic force I couldn't resist. She's only going to start coming around more and more, Taylor said, her voice low but tinged with unmistakable irritation. I know, Caleb sounded tired, maybe a little helpless. If she really wants to help, she should just write a check, not keep showing up and disrupting the way we run our home. Taylor's voice sharpened, a brittle edge creeping in. She's not struggling, she's sitting on her pension, and whatever savings she has left, we're the ones who actually need financial support. The plate in my hands nearly slipped into the sink. The tiny clatter it made seemed deafening in the hushed kitchen. I quickly turned the water down, trying not to make another sound. She probably just wants to help. Caleb's voice dropped even lower, as if he were trying to ease the tension. Taylor gave a cold, dismissive laugh. Help, then be straightforward about it. Don't meddle with Lola's education. Don't interrupt our plans. She paused, then added, voice harder now. She's always inserting herself. She wants to offer financial help, but also wants emotional involvement. It's too much. Silence fell. Even the ticking of a clock in the next room sounded painfully loud. Finally, Caleb let out a long, weary sigh. He didn't argue. All he said, softly, was, I know, I'll take care of it. I stood frozen at the sink, my hands still submerged in water that had long since gone cold. My heart thudded dully, like something clenched in a fist too tightly. All this time, I thought I was, at the very least, still family. Imperfect, maybe, but understood. Accepted. Loved. But now I saw the truth. In their world, I was nothing more than a number. A pension account. A potential checkbook. Not a real part of their daily lives. Just a small, private economic support system, quietly tapped when needed. I wiped my damp hands on my sleeves, forcing myself to breathe deeply. The scent of coffee and dish soap mixed in the air, nauseating me. I don't know how long I stood there. Eventually, footsteps approached the kitchen doorway. I hastily composed my face, pretending to be absorbed in drying the last plate. Mom. Caleb's voice was warm. Careful. Take a break. I can finish up. I turned toward him, offering a soft, distant smile. A smile that said I hadn't heard a thing. It's fine, I said quietly. Almost done. He hesitated for a beat, as if sensing something was off. But in the end, he didn't ask. By the time I left their house that night, the darkness had fully settled in. The coastal wind whipped against my face, sharp and biting. I walked slowly, my shoes crunching over the gravel path, each step making a brittle, lonely sound. In my hand, I carried the now empty cookie tin, though it felt as heavy as a stone. When I finally reached my apartment and closed the door behind me, I let my back sag against it, shutting my eyes. No tears came, only an empty, hollow feeling stretched wide inside me. A deeper kind of emotion began to spread through me. Something heavier than sadness, colder than anger. It was a raw, bone-deep clarity. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. I pulled up my bank account and stared at the shrinking balance displayed on the screen. All this time, I had believed that if I gave enough, if I kept giving without complaint, I would secure a place for myself in their world. But now I understood. Not every sacrifice is seen as love. Sometimes, it's simply seen as a resource. Something available, something expected. I closed the laptop and lifted my eyes to the window. Outside, the night stretched out like a deep, endless net, casting its heavy shroud over the city. And there, sitting quietly at the edge of that dark net, I finally found a small, piercing moment of clarity. On Saturday afternoon, the sun poured warmly over the streets of the little coastal town. I stood in front of Caleb's house, a small bag with a new toy dangling from my hand, and drew in a deep breath. Today was Lola's birthday party. Taylor had invited a few neighbors and some of Lola's school friends. I had promised to help with the decorations and brought along a special surprise for Lola handmade miniature stage set, complete with her favorite little puppets. There was a small flicker of hope inside me. Maybe today wouldn't feel so awkward. Maybe, just maybe, I could reclaim a little piece of the warmth that once belonged to family. The house was filled with the sound of children laughing and chattering. Balloons floated under the ceiling. Streamers swayed lightly in the breeze from the air conditioning. I placed the gift on a small side table and headed into the kitchen to help set up plates. Taylor moved briskly between parents, giving directions while tapping out rapid replies on her phone, busy but efficient. Caleb was in the backyard, setting up a tent, that familiar easygoing smile still plastered across his face. I kept my head down and worked quietly, careful not to disrupt their flow. Later, it was time to blow out the candles. Lola, wearing a birthday crown, sat proudly in front of her cake. I stood near the edge of the room, smiling quietly. Caleb bent down and whispered something into her ear. Lola blinked, then suddenly jumped off her chair and ran straight toward me, grabbing my hand. "Grandma, you have to make a wish with me." The room fell silent, all eyes turning sharply toward me. I froze for a second, instinctively glancing at Taylor. Her smile faltered, tight and strained, and a flash of unmistakable displeasure flickered through her eyes. Caleb hurried to smooth things over, laughing. "Of course, sweetheart, it's your birthday wish, after all." Lola pulled me toward the cake. She closed her eyes, and in the soft glow of the candles, her little voice rang out, pure and sweet. "I wish Grandma would always play house with me, and always do little stage plays with me." My throat tightened painfully. My eyes burned. But even in that tender moment, I saw Taylor off to the side, clutching a napkin so tightly her knuckles turned white, her gaze like a blade of cold steel. When Lola blew out the candles, the tiny flame of hope inside me went out with them. That night, after the games and the laughter faded, and the guests trickled out, only a few of us remained in the living room. The air relaxed slightly, but something underneath remained taut and brittle. I sat nursing a cold cup of coffee, until finally, I spoke. My voice was quiet, but it pierced the room like a needle in still air. "Caleb, Taylor," I began, pausing to steady myself. "I need to ask you something." They both turned to face me. "In your eyes." I met their gazes, steady and unflinching. "Am I family or just a financial supporter?" Silence thickened around us. Caleb opened his mouth, but his smile had frozen on his face. Taylor set her cup down carefully, her expression smooth but hard. "Judy," she said, her voice polite and clipped, "no one sees you as just a bank. But this is our family. We have our own way of doing things. What we need is support, not interference." Caleb rushed to add, "Mom, it's not that we don't appreciate everything. It's just, sometimes, you do too much. We need our own space." "Our own space." I echoed, the words heavy in my chest. Taylor nodded, cool and firm. "Yes, we're grateful for the money, but that doesn't give you the right to control how we live our lives." In that moment, everything snapped into brutal clarity. It wasn't that I hadn't given enough. It wasn't that I hadn't loved enough. It was that, from the very beginning, I had stood in the wrong place. I had been loving them in a way they neither needed nor wanted. They had always wanted something else, something I could never be. I placed the coffee cup down and stood up. My throat was dry, but my voice was steady, almost eerily calm. "I understand, Mom," Caleb called after me, but I didn't turn around. I grabbed my coat, pushed open the door, and stepped into the damp, salty night air. Under the street lamp, my shadow stretched long and small against the pavement. When I reached my apartment, I tossed the coat onto a chair and collapsed onto the sofa, drained and hollow. The room was so quiet I could hear the old heater rumbling faintly in the corner. Finally, I whispered to myself. Enough, Judy. Enough. I woke up early the next morning. The sky outside was still dark, and only the soft whisper of the sea breeze stirred beyond the windows. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, each sound like a gentle but insistent reminder. It was time for a change. I brewed myself a strong black coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. Opening my laptop, the cold glow of the screen washed over my face. I pulled up the joint bank account I shared with Caleb. Every month, a set amount was automatically deducted to cover their mortgage payment. The mortgage for a house bought with half a lifetime savings. A house I had been quietly subsidizing month after month. I stared at the numbers for a long time. My fingers hovered over the cancel automatic payment option. A small flicker of hesitation crossed my mind, but it was swiftly overpowered by a clarity sharper than anything I had ever felt. I clicked confirm. A prompt popped up. Are you sure you want to cancel this automatic payment plan? I took a deep breath and pressed yes. Then, I opened my email and drafted a short, formal message to Caleb. Subject: adjustment to mortgage support. Caleb, starting next month, I will no longer be contributing to your mortgage payments. The house is your responsibility, and it's time for you to fully own it. This does not mean I love you any less. It simply means I must start taking responsibility for my own future as well. I hope you understand. Mom. I reread it once, made no edits, and without a second thought, hit send. As the email left my outbox, a hollow space opened inside me, but it didn't stay empty for long. A faint but unmistakable sense of freedom began to rise, slowly filling in the cracks. Around noon, my phone lit up. Caleb was calling. I didn't answer right away. I let the phone ring 3 times before finally picking it up. Mom, did you make a mistake? Caleb's voice was rushed, anxious. I leaned against the kitchen doorframe, watching the rows of palm trees sway outside in the wind, and spoke with a calmness that even surprised me. No, Caleb, I said. I didn't make a mistake. It's time for you and Taylor to stand on your own. There was a pause. Then, he said in a low, uneasy voice. But Mom, things have been tough lately. Taylor just switched jobs. The mortgage is a lot to handle right now. I understand, I interrupted gently. But you're both adults now. And being an adult means carrying the weight of your own choices. I heard him exhale slowly, heavily, the sound of a man cornered by realities he wasn't ready to face. I could almost see him pacing the living room, frowning, hands running through his hair. The little boy who once held my hand so tightly had grown up, and learned how to negotiate first with pleading, then with pressure. But I didn't blame him. It was me. I had taught him, unknowingly, that my sacrifices would always be there, invisible, bottomless. Mom. His voice cracked slightly. Are you still mad at me? I closed my eyes for a moment, taking in a slow, steady breath. I'm not mad, I said softly. I'm just, finally seeing things clearly. I finally understood. I couldn't keep offering pieces of myself to earn a place where I was only ever tolerated, never truly welcomed. After I hung up, I sank into the couch, listening to the sound of the wind off the sea. There were no tears, no anger, just a quiet, firm resolve taking root deep inside me. This time, I would not look back. Early spring on the coast still carried a lingering chill in the air. The wind stirred the little wind chimes outside the corner cafe, their soft clinking marking the rhythm of a changing season. I tucked my hands deeper into the pockets of my coat and pulled it tighter around me, walking slowly down the sidewalk. The small sycamore trees along the street had just begun to bud, a fragile layer of green misting against the pale, gray-blue sky. For the first time, I was walking this path with no weight on my shoulders. Not to buy groceries for someone else, not rushing to pick up a child, not scrambling to cover another bill, just walking because I wanted to. It had been 3 weeks since I moved into my small downtown apartment. It wasn't big, but it was clean, bright, and from the window, I could hear the soft crash of waves against the seawall. Best of all, it was close to the theater where I had spent so much of my life. There was something quietly reassuring about that. The first week, I often woke in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, my heart hollow and drifting. I felt like a child who had wandered too far from home. realizing that the place they thought belonged to them never truly did. But little by little, I began to adjust. I got used to brewing a cup of Earl Grey just for myself each morning. I got used to days unfolding without needing to accommodate anyone else's schedule. I got used to evenings spent organizing my old props and mementos under the soft wash of sunset. Today, I was headed to an open class at the local community art center. A Hanson workshop for prop design. Not for work. Not to prove anything. Just because, when I heard about it, something inside me stirred. That old, thrilling flutter of excitement. The reminder that I was still alive, still had passions to rediscover, still had so much more of myself waiting to be lived. The community center was housed in a lovingly restored old building, with brick walls, arched windows, and a row of windswept dwarf pines out front. The moment I stepped inside, I was greeted by the warm smell of wood shavings and paint. A handful of people, all different ages, gathered around a large table cutting paper, sewing, building models. There was an older man in khakis and a baseball cap, an elderly woman in a floral dress and oversized glasses, and a few younger volunteers carrying supplies. A woman with short gray hair and a raspy but cheerful voice waved me over. New face, first time here. She handed me a starter kit of tools and materials. I nodded and smiled, taking it from her. The feel of canvas and wood beneath my fingers sent a quiet shock of familiarity through me. It felt like slipping back into the old theater days, sewing props by hand under dim lights. I chose a seat by the tall arched windows. Sunlight streamed onto the table, warm and golden. The class was simple, especially for someone like me, who had spent decades crafting stage sets. It felt less like learning, and more like having a conversation with a younger version of myself. The instructor guided us in building miniature stage dioramas using old wood frames, scraps of fabric, and sheets of paper. I quickly lost myself in the rhythm of it. The snip of scissors cutting fabric, the quick sting of hot glue on my fingertips, the careful assembly of tiny panels. Soft conversations and the occasional ripple of laughter floated around the room. But the overwhelming energy was one of quiet focus and joy. When I finally smoothed the last scrap of backdrop cloth into place and leaned back to admire my little model stage, a rare, deep satisfaction swelled in my chest. It wasn't for approval. It wasn't for permission. It was simply because I wanted to create something. I snapped a picture of my work and posted it to the social media account I almost never used. I added a simple caption. Today, I built a little stage of my own again. The moment I hit post, I couldn't help but laugh softly to myself, like I had quietly lit a tiny lantern inside my heart. That afternoon, when I returned home and was about to make myself a cup of tea, my phone lit up. It was a text from Caleb. Mom, are you doing okay lately? Just a few short words, filled with a tentative, careful tone. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I leaned against the kitchen counter and simply stared at the message, letting the silence wrap gently around me. Meanwhile, just a few streets away at a sports bar, Caleb was sitting across from his childhood friend, Mike, nursing a beer with a frustrated scowl. She just cut off all the support, Caleb muttered, taking a long, irritated swig. She's never done anything like this before. Mike shot him a glance, setting his glass down with a quiet thud. He spoke slowly, without judgment, but with an edge Caleb couldn't ignore. When was the last time you actually asked what she needed? Mike asked. Caleb froze, caught off guard. You've been taking her money, her time, her love. Mike went on, his voice steady. But have you ever stopped to think that maybe what she needs isn't your neediness, but your respect? That word, respect. Simple, and yet, hearing it, Caleb felt a slow, creeping shame he couldn't shake. Later that night, driving home, the street lights blurred past his windshield, one after another, retreating into the dark. His hands gripped the steering wheel. Mike's words echoing relentlessly in his mind. Respect. Such a small word. Such a crushing realization. And at that very same moment, in my little downtown apartment, I sat quietly under the soft glow of a lamp, cradling a warm cup of Earl Grey in my hands. I flipped through the schedule for next week's craft workshops, a faint smile playing at the corners of my mouth. Outside, The sea breeze was cool against the windows. But inside, the room was warm. And slowly, quietly, so was my heart. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of my apartment, glaring off the floor in sharp, blinding patches. I sat at the small kitchen table, flipping through the community activity brochure, debating whether to sign up for a pottery workshop next week. My phone lay quiet in the corner of the table, but the screen kept lighting up, then dimming, then lighting up again. It was Caleb. I hesitated, then silently switched it to mute. A low, uneasy feeling curled in my chest. Hours later, the phone buzzed again, this time with a text. "Mom, can we talk soon? There's something I need to discuss with you." I sighed, not replying right away. Instead, I flipped the phone face down and kept my eyes on the colorful pages filled with class listings. Outside, the wind creaked the weather vane on the telephone pole, the sound slicing through the tense, brittle silence in the air. At the same time, across town in Caleb's kitchen, things were teetering on the edge of an explosion. "You have no plan whatsoever." Taylor's voice was almost a shout, her hand slamming a stack of bills onto the kitchen table. Caleb rubbed his forehead wearily, frustration leaking into his voice. "I'm doing everything I can. Taylor, I'm paying the mortgage. Covering expenses. What more do you want from me?" "What more?" Taylor gave a short, cold laugh, her face pale and tight. "Since your mother stopped sending money, our financial pressure has doubled. And you," she spat the words like ice, "you just stand there and complain without doing anything real to fix it." At the staircase, little Lola clung to the railing, her tiny hands gripping it tightly. She stood there silently, head bowed, watching her parents fight with wide, worried eyes. The overhead light flickered slightly, the tension in the house stretching tighter and tighter. Caleb slammed his hand against the table, making the glasses rattle. "She's my mother," he roared. "She's helped us more than enough. What more do you want from her? She has her own life, she's not our bank." Taylor bit down hard, tears brimming in her eyes but refusing to fall. "We have our lives too," she choked out, her voice cracking. "If we can't even secure the basics, what kind of life is that?" The argument broke off abruptly. Only the ticking of the kitchen clock and Lola's small, muffled sobs filled the heavy air. Caleb turned and saw his daughter crouched by the stairs, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her little sweater. Something inside him twisted painfully, yanking away all the anger, all the resentment in an instant. Later that night, Caleb sat slumped on the living room couch, his head buried in his hands. Taylor sat across from him, clutching Lola tightly, her eyes rimmed red. The house was still the same, but something vital had gone missing, like a cornerstone had been quietly pulled out, and the whole structure was starting to crack. Meanwhile, that same night, I sat alone on my tiny balcony, holding a mug of hot chocolate, listening to the far-off sound of the ocean. A strange, uneasy feeling welled up inside me, an old, familiar sixth sense that only mothers seem to possess. I glanced down at my phone, still resting on the table inside. The same unread text glowed faintly on the screen. After a long moment of hesitation, I finally tapped out a reply. "I'm free tomorrow afternoon." As soon as I sent it, I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. The wind carried a salty tang, brushing across my face, like the embers of an old life still smoldering softly in the dark. The next day, I spoke with Caleb over the phone. His voice sounded tired, heavy with a weight he hadn't yet figured out how to carry. "Mom, Taylor and we've been arguing a lot," he said, pausing before adding, almost to himself. "Maybe it started when you stopped the mortgage support." I didn't answer right away. I just listened. He went on, "I know we can't depend on you anymore. It's just, facing reality is harder than I thought." His voice dropped, stripped of the last layers of youthful illusion. "Caleb," I finally said, my voice soft but firm, "hardship isn't an excuse. Every person eventually has to take responsibility for their own home, their own choices." "I know," he whispered. There was a brief silence. Then I heard Lola's small, sweet voice calling from the background. "Daddy," Caleb hurriedly said. "Mom, I'll call you later." Before hanging up, I set the phone down and lifted my gaze to the window. The sunlight poured in golden sheets across the street, where the oak trees were bursting with new green leaves. trembling slightly in the breeze. Somewhere deep inside, a tiny seed of strength was beginning to root itself. Not for them, not to prove anything, but finally, for me. The March sea breeze still carried a bite of cold. Wrapped in a light gray scarf, I sat alone in the old cafe by the shore. A half-collapsed latte sat on the table in front of me, the foam sagging at the edges. Through the window, I could see a few fishing boats docked at the pier, their flags snapping sharply in the wind. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly time. The door chime jingled softly. I looked up and saw Caleb step inside. He wore a blue hoodie, his brow furrowed so tightly it seemed he was carrying the weight of the world. When he spotted me, he pressed his lips together and quickly made his way over. "Mom," he said as he pulled out a chair and sat down, his voice quieter than usual. I smiled faintly and nodded. But I didn't say anything right away. I simply gave him the space to find his own words. The wind rattled softly against the windows. Slow jazz played over the speakers, blending with the faint hiss of the espresso machine. Caleb stared down at the table, fidgeting anxiously with the rim of the coffee cup someone had left behind. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "Mom, I want to apologize." He lifted his eyes to mine, and in them, I saw a glimmer of something raw and sincere. Not the bitter, resentful man the world sometimes seemed to have shaped him into, but the small boy who used to look up at me after falling down, hoping for comfort. My heart softened, but outwardly I kept my expression warm and even. "I know you've done so much for us over the years," Caleb went on, his voice rough around the edges. "And I took it all for granted. I just assumed you would always be there, always helping." He paused, letting out a heavy breath. "It wasn't until you stopped that I realized what I lost wasn't just money. It was your trust, your presence." I listened silently, letting each word settle in its own time. "I can't keep expecting you to catch me every time I stumble," he said with a bitter little laugh. "I can't keep using your love as an excuse for my own immaturity." There was guilt in his voice, exhaustion, but also a late-blooming clarity. It made my chest ache, but it also brought a quiet sense of release. I picked up my coffee and took a slow sip, letting the warm bitterness coat my throat. Then, I finally spoke. "Caleb," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "love isn't a transaction. It's not something measured in dollars, or maintained through endless sacrifice." I paused, making sure he was really listening. His gaze stayed locked on mine. "I helped you because I love you, but that love was never supposed to be assumed. Never supposed to be endless in the face of disrespect." I leaned forward slightly. "I'm not a bank. I'm not an emergency rescue service. I'm your mother." My voice was steady, each word clearing away the tangled misunderstandings and misplaced expectations between us. Caleb dropped his gaze, his finger tracing mindless circles on the tabletop, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I get it now, Mom," he said softly. "I'll do better. I will." I sighed, reaching across the table to gently pat his hand. "I'm not asking for compensation," I said. "I'm asking that from now on, we treat each other like two independent people, with mutual respect, with care, without confusing love with dependence." Outside, I could hear children laughing as they rode their bikes along the waterfront, and the sunlight, filtered through the windows, dappled warmly across our table. Caleb looked up at me again, and for the first time in a long time, his face relaxed just a little into something open, boyish, genuine. He nodded, a seriousness in his eyes that reminded me of the way he used to show off when he first learned to tie his own shoelaces. The conversation didn't last long, but it was more real, more weighty, than 100 casual check-ins we'd had before. We didn't fix everything that day. We didn't pretend everything was fine with a few easy words. But we started again. This time from a place of maturity, of equality. When we said goodbye, Caleb leaned in to hug me. It was a little awkward, but it was genuine. "Thank you, Mom," he said quietly. I patted his back and smiled. "Go home," I said. "There's someone waiting for you there." I watched him walk away, then sat back down and ordered another coffee. Outside, the sea breeze rushed across the docks, carrying with it the briny scent of salt and freedom. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt light. truly light. As if, after a long, long journey, I had finally set down my burden. And in its place, there was nothing but peace. Nothing but freedom. In April, the coastal town softened under a gentler sun. New buds unfurled on the treetops, and the flower beds at the corners of the streets burst into vibrant blooms of pansies. I walked toward the community center with an old canvas tote slung over my shoulder. Inside it, a small project I had recently finished. A handcrafted miniature stage set titled The Changing Face of Home. Today, the Community Arts Center was hosting its spring exhibition. One of the coordinators had called me personally, inviting me to display my work in a small corner of the public gallery. It wasn't a grand event, just neighbors and familiar faces milling around. But to me, it meant everything. The exhibition hall wasn't large. Old wooden beams ran across the ceiling, and the open windows let streams of sunlight pour in at slanted angles. I carefully arranged my miniature stage, adjusting each piece until every panel and every tiny light was just right. An older gentleman passing by paused, admiring it. "So intricate," he said. "Looks just like a real backstage scene." I smiled and thanked him, a quiet, glowing satisfaction rising in my chest. Not for recognition, not for anyone else, just because this was something I had once loved deeply, and now, it belonged to me again. Not long after the exhibition started, my old theater friend Nancy showed up. She was the kind of eternal community spark plug, always buzzing with enthusiasm. "Nancy." I waved her over. She laughed and hurried to my display, nodding eagerly as she looked it over. "You know," she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "our community theater is launching a new stage design course for the senior group. We're looking for someone experienced to help as a consultant and instructor." I raised my eyebrows, surprised. "Would you consider it?" Nancy patted my hand. "Not for the money, just to help people like you. People who once buried themselves in the demands of life, to find their stage again." Looking at her bright, earnest smile, my heart gave a hard, unexpected thump. It felt like seeing a lighthouse flickering to life across a dark, deserted coastline. That very afternoon, I signed the agreement. 1 day a week, I would guide the silver-haired group in building stage backdrops and run small prop-making workshops. Not full-time, not all-consuming, just enough to keep the spark alive, enough to stay creative, to stay vibrant, to stay alive. As I walked out of the Arts Center that day, the streets were bathed in sunlight, and the breeze carried the unmistakable scent of spring. I tightened my grip on the canvas bag, my steps so light it felt like I had shed a decade's worth of weight. A few days later, it was time for Caleb and Taylor to finalize the mortgage transfer. Because I had been a co-signer on the original loan, I was required to attend and formally remove my name. The meeting was held in a sleek downtown office building, its walls gleaming with glass and steel. I wore a crisp linen shirt, black trousers, and a simple silver necklace. When I entered the conference room, Caleb and Taylor were already seated, dressed neatly but visibly tense. A tall stack of loan documents and contract modifications sat on the table between us. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read through the paperwork. I sat quietly, calm and composed, signing where needed with a hand as steady as a rock. Not a single unnecessary word, just the occasional, detached glance toward Caleb. There was no anger in my gaze, no resentment, only release. Taylor's fingers trembled slightly as she gripped her pen. Caleb bit his lip hard as he signed under the mortgage responsibility section. His handwriting slow, deliberate. In that moment, I could almost hear it, the invisible thread that had tied me to their lives, finally snapping free. My name no longer tethered to their future. Finally, I had returned it to myself. When the signing was done, the lawyer gathered the documents with a polite smile. "Congratulations, everyone," he said. "The transfer is officially complete." I stood, gave a small, courteous nod, and turned to leave. Behind me, Caleb's voice called out quietly, "Mom." I paused and looked back. Sunlight flooded through the glass walls, stretching their shadows long and thin across the room. His eyes were filled with something complicated, something tangled between regret and gratitude. I smiled gently, said nothing, needed to say nothing. I turned, and walked out of the conference room. Downstairs, the street was alive with people, the breeze tousling the strands of silver in my hair. I stood there a moment, eyes closed, breathing in the air. An air free of burdens, full only of possibility. The sunlight warmed my shoulders. And my steps, they were light enough to fly. This time, I wasn't walking away for anyone else. I was finally, truly, setting sail for myself. The morning sun was so bright it almost hurt to look at. I stood in front of the downtown community art gallery, clutching a freshly printed stack of exhibition flyers in my hand. Inside me, expectation and nerves wrestled in equal measure. It was just a small exhibition. Just a few handcrafted miniature stage sets and models. But to me, it felt like a long overdue rite of passage. My first true, public unveiling. Something purely my own. The gallery wasn't large. The wooden floors gleamed underfoot, and the white walls were adorned with colorful paintings by neighborhood children. Glass display cases showcased handmade jewelry and tiny sculptures. My miniature stage sat in a cozy corner by the window, bathed in the soft glow of a small, warm spotlight that made the little props and scenery glow gently. I stood next to my piece, quietly welcoming the trickle of visitors who wandered through. Some paused, leaning in to admire the details. Some complimented the craftsmanship. Some asked about the process with genuine curiosity. Every lingering glance, every word of praise, felt like a tiny light flickering to life inside me. Small but warm, steady but sure. Just before noon, the door chime jingled again. I looked up and there she was. Lola. She wore a floral dress, her honey brown curls catching the sunlight as she raced toward me, clutching a piece of cardboard tightly against her chest. Behind her, a few steps slower, were Caleb and Taylor. Their movements were a little hesitant, their faces a little stiff. Lola skidded to a stop in front of me, her eyes sparkling. She lifted the cardboard proudly above her head. "Grandma, I made this for you." I crouched down and took the offering from her tiny hands. The drawing was clumsy but radiant. On the paper, she had drawn a little stage, with a grandmother in a blue dress standing at center stage, and a small girl beside her, holding a balloon splashed in every color imaginable. Above them, twinkling lights filled the backdrop. And across the stage, in big, proud letters, she had written, "Home." My throat tightened painfully. I quickly ducked my head to hide it. "Thank you, sweetheart," I whispered, gently ruffling her soft curls. Lola giggled and tilted her head up at me, her face solemn in the most innocent way. "My teacher said home can be something you keep in your heart," she declared. "So I made a little stage just for you to live in." I nodded, smiling so hard it almost hurt, my heart melting into a puddle of pure, aching joy. Caleb came up behind her, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Mom," he said, his voice sincere, "the exhibition, it's amazing, really." Taylor followed, her expression still slightly reserved, but her tone surprisingly soft. "Your work, it's beautiful," she said quietly. "Anne, I'm sorry, for a lot of things. For misunderstanding you. For not seeing you." I smiled and nodded, offering no questions, no demands. Some wounds didn't need to be reopened. Some apologies, when truly felt, were enough. We stood together for a while, watching Lola twirl and skip through the gallery aisles. Sunlight poured through the high skylights, stretching our shadows long and weightless across the floor. The air smelled faintly of paint and coffee. Soft conversation hummed in the background. There were no grand reunions. No tirfeljacs. Just a slow, quiet mending. A gentle understanding. Finally finding the right distance to hold each other without pulling or pushing too hard. After the exhibition wrapped up, Caleb offered to take me out for lunch. I declined, smiling. "Another time," I said. "Today, I want to keep a little time just for myself." They didn't insist. They understood. Before leaving, Lola gave me one last fierce little hug, her arms wrapped tightly around my waist. "Grandma, next time I'm going to draw you an even bigger stage," she shouted with gleeful determination. I laughed, promising, "I'll be waiting for it." I watched them walk away before I packed up my small stage sets and stepped back out into the world. The spring wind tossed colorful flags along the streets, and I clutched Lola's simple, heart felt drawing close to my chest. Inside me, everything felt soft, like the first thaw of snow after a long, hard winter. In early May, the breeze along the coast finally carried the scent of summer. The air was warm and humming, the sea shimmered under the sun, and the cafe at the corner spilled out onto the sidewalk with fresh flowers and strings of tiny lights. I wore a simple linen dress and my old canvas shoes, walking alone toward the exhibition hall, carrying a small box that held a new miniature stage set, one I had built by hand. Tonight was the spring showcase for the Silver Stage project. But this time, I wasn't just an exhibitor. I was a teacher. Outside the gallery, a lively crowd had already gathered. Neighbors, students, families, even a young reporter from the local paper. The town's old residents, dressed plainly with coffee cups in hand, bustled around the handmade art pieces, admiring and chatting animatedly. I stood off to the side, watching my students proudly present their work to curious onlookers, and a slow, deep warmth filled my chest. It wasn't pride in the traditional sense. It wasn't about achievement or accolades. It was something quieter, stronger, a real, grounded sense of belonging, a sense of having a place, of having value. As the evening wound down, a young woman in casual clothes and oversized glasses approached me. She introduced herself as an editor for a small local culture magazine and handed me her card with a smile. "Your story is inspiring," she said. "We're planning a special issue on senior artists next month. Would you be willing to do an interview?" I blinked, momentarily caught off guard, then smiled as a long-dormant confidence stirred awake inside me. "I'd love to," I answered softly. Night fell gently over the little town. The exhibition ended, and the crowd thinned, scattering into the warm darkness. I packed up my work and stepped outside. The sea breeze lifted the hem of my skirt, carrying the salty breath of the ocean. The distant coastline blurred into a soft curve under the deepening sky, and the town's lights shimmered like scattered silver coins in the night. I walked slowly along the coastal path, past the cafe, past the post office, past all the familiar corners I had once rushed by, too busy to notice. Eventually, I stopped in the middle of the small square outside the exhibition hall. There was an empty lot there, once reserved for a new community project that never quite took off. Now, it held only a weathered wooden sign, painted with simple white letters. "Your story starts here." I stood before it, unmoving, letting the words soak deep into my heart. I thought back over the past year, the aching loneliness, the sting of being cast aside by the people I loved, the clumsy, painful work of piecing myself back together. And now, standing here, on this familiar yet brand new ground, with no one else defining me, and I understood, at last, that every chapter of my life was meant to be written by my own hand, not by my son, not by my family, not by the expectations of others. Mine, and mine alone. The life ahead of me would unfold step by step, like a voyage down an uncharted path. I didn't know where it would lead, but every step would be steady. Every step would be mine. I turned for one last look at the exhibition hall across the square. The string of small lights along the porch flickered gently in the breeze, soft and warm, like tiny beacons lit for every soul brave enough to begin again. I smiled and whispered to myself, "This time, I'll write the story my own way."